What is This Is Water by David Foster Wallace?
This is Water by David Foster Wallace was a commencement speech he gave to a graduating class, I think in 2005. And in it, he was able to express what he viewed was the importance of liberal education and just education in general. I think the main claim to the commencement speech is the point of education is to teach you how to think. And that's important because the capital T truth to him, he claims, is that we get to decide what is meaningful in our lives. And if we are well adjusted to life, we are able to choose to not really live our default mode of thinking, which is a self-centered one, but rather, if you're well educated, you're able to choose to live a different way that is more meaningful. So that's why I would say This Is Water is. And the reason why it stood out to me was because he does a great job of speaking to the culture. It's very culturally relevant, but it's also very nuanced and new. It's kind of fresh. I like the freshness of it. It's like you can't really boil it down to this an expression of this ideology or that ideology, but the way I see it, it's like a very good blend of postmodernism, of relativism, of idealism, and of pragmatism. And we can break those things down. That's kind of what I want to break down. But why did you think that this speech was worthwhile?
What I thought was insightful about this commencement speech was the way in which he stripped down sort of our environment. I mean, that's the title of the piece, is This Is Water, which comes from the little story about the two fish swimming along, and an older fish swims past them and asks them how the water is, and they keep swimming, and then they say, "What the hell is water?" Because they don't know what it is that that their environment consists of, and so they're sort of obviously unaware of a great deal of their reality as it fundamentally exists. And so it, to me, speaks of the need for people to be on the lookout for what it is that their environment is, and then also to be taking stock of it, not just noting that there is an environment, but sort of assessing it. And that's obviously just one core aspect of the speech, but I think that was, it's kind of a lame one, but that was pretty powerful to me. I also appreciate the idea of being able to reframe your circumstances, and most people live as though everything is happening to them. That's something that he says. And that viewpoint restricts circumstances to either be, I don't know about either. His point was, if you're suffering through that grocery trip that he talks about, where everything in your life is conspiring against you to make your life difficult and suffering, and there's nothing good, and this is all happening to you just while you get groceries after work during your commute home, and everyone else is doing that too, and everything's stacked against you to just give you a difficulty that is unfortunate, and it causes you to suffer, and you hate it for that, and you hate your life and yourself, but more so other people, because they're causing it for you. And he says that what is capital T true, like you said, is that you get to control how you respond to that. And that is such a crucial fact, dare I say, that gets overlooked. People don't consider that to be within their control. And that lack of agency, I think, leads to a lot of the suffering that people do. And so to me, it's exciting to discuss why it is that we might suffer from a lack of agency and then the consequences of that, and how we could regain agency through a bit of reframing and some truths that we could hold on to in difficult times.
Yeah. Well, shall we dive into it?
Take it away.
All right. Well, he starts off the commencement speech with, an introduction, a greeting. And he says there are these two young fish swimming along. And they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" He says this is a standard requirement of U.S. commencement speeches, the deployment of didactic little parable-ish stories. The story thing turns out to be one of the better, less bullshitty conventions of the genre. But if you're worried that I plan to present myself here as the wise older fish, explaining that water is to you younger fish, what water is to you younger fish, please don't be. I am not the wise old fish. The point of the fish story is merely that the more obvious, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. Stated as an English sentence, of course, this is just a banal platitude, but the fact is that in the day-to-day trenches of adult existence, banal platitudes can have a life or death importance, or so I wish to suggest to you on this dry and lovely morning. And so I like that he kind of has a little thesis statement here, like what's the point of the whole speech? And even how he kind of begs, like the point I'm trying to make is a life or death importance. I think that's an important fact of how what's being asserted in the speech has grave importance. Not just important practically, but truly, like if you don't heed this, it could be life or death. So it's quite a bold proclamation.
Yes. I do think he backs it up, though.
Yeah.
It's reminding me of, not to compare it to scripture, but it's reminding me of Moses in Deuteronomy, and he's talking to the Israeli people, and he's basically laying out like all the things that God is telling them to do, and it's coming from God, so sort of from the source. But he says the same thing, that it's life and death, and you could choose blessing or you could choose cursing, and those are associated with life and then with death. And I think that this is becoming more and more apparent to me, that what I find to be of such great value in the scriptures is the direction towards the things that are life-giving and away from the things that are life-taking or, death-bringing. And I don't know that was obvious to me as a child, which is probably more to do with immaturity in myself than anything else. But I guess as we continue to live our lives and discuss Christian ideas with people, it's, that might be a good rule of thumb. Like, hey, does this have to do with life or death? And I don't just mean like physical life or death. Like, we're going to talk about a bit of a more metaphysical standpoint on this. Like, are you actually living because you believe this thing, or are you just claiming that it has that significance and sort of standing on it dogmatically with no reason to, like just because it's the party line, and that's very important to me, That's a good heuristic, maybe.
It's a good what?
Heuristic?
What is that?
It's I don't know, like an interpretive framework.
Oh.
I can look it up.
I gotta look it up. How do you spell that?
Heuristic.
Involving or enabling discovery or problem solving through methods such as experimentation, evaluation, trial and error. A rule or piece of information used in or enabling problem solving or decision making.
Yeah, so the heuristic would be, does this have to do with life or death?
Yeah. That's good. That's a good word.
Thanks. I didn't make it up.
Oh, yeah. I know. You're not that clever.
No.
To continue on, of course, the main requirement of speeches like this is that I'm supposed to talk about your liberal arts education's meaning, to try to explain why the degree you're about to receive has actual human value instead of just a material payoff. So let's talk about the single most pervasive cliche in the commencement speech genre, which is that a liberal arts education is not so much about filling you up with knowledge as it is about, quote, teaching you how to think. If you're like me as a student, you never liked hearing this. You tend to feel a bit insulted by the claim that you needed anybody to teach you how to think. Since the fact that you even got admitted to a college this good seems like proof that you already know how to think. But I'm going to posit to you that the liberal arts cliche turns out not to be insulting at all, because the really significant education and thinking that we're supposed to get in a place like this isn't really about the capacity to think, but rather about the choice of what to think about. If your total freedom of choice regarding what to think about seems too obvious to waste time discussing, I'd ask you to think about fish and water, and to bracket for just a few moments your skepticism about the value of the totally obvious. You want to break any of that down?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to teaching you how to think, sort of, I don't know, something that I'm thinking of in the context of the fish and the water is that they're the most difficult things to see and discuss, is what he says earlier. And so if that's true, then if someone is teaching you how to think, then if they're doing it properly, it would be sort of giving you the ability to take those difficult to see and think, or discuss and see things, and allowing you to incorporate them in your models for your life. And very often, teaching you how to think is juxtaposed with teaching you what to think. And the what to think version is certainly much worse, because it's only offering you someone else's interpretation of what you should think, rather than what you specifically should think. And yeah, I guess I was homeschooled and sort of raised on this philosophy, and so there's a big part of me that believes that, and I find it to be true when I encounter other people that are, they don't care. Like if the fish swam by, they don't even say, what is water? Like they don't even care at all. And so that nothing scares me more than that person. And I don't know why that is. Maybe it was me for a while or something, and I've learned that I don't ever want to be like that anymore again. But of course, we all are in our own ways, and they are the most difficult things to talk about. So anyway, that was just something that I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I think it ties kind of well into what we were talking about last podcast, because it has like this metacognition element to it, like thinking about how you think.
Yeah.
That's what I say metacognition is. And so it's really hard to think about how you think. It's really easy to think about things, but when the subject matter to think about is how you think, it's kind of like it could be discombobulating.
Yeah.
And so I like that this is kind of like to help you orient what to think about is a um, product of good education. How to properly see what is worth your consideration, and not necessarily forming what conclusions you come to, but even aiding you in your ability to come to a conclusion that is in keeping, like to be able to actually analyze and to ponder and then formulate an interpretation of it that is actually viable. Um, this appeals to me because, I mean, going back to college has been very interesting to me. And that's why I like this speech too, because, like, in this next paragraph, well, the next couple of paragraphs, he really tackles it head on. And he's already kind of segue into that. Like, there's a wrong approach to education and there's a right approach to education. And I think it's really hard for instructors to toe that line because, I mean, being humans, obviously, when you value something, you believe that that ought to be shared. You come to the conclusion it's a valuable thing. And if you actually think it's valuable, you believe it will be valuable to everybody. Which is very much the case of any ideologies. Like, if you actually believe that the ideology is worthwhile and true, of course, it would actually be, it would behoove you to help people realize that your worldview is not only helpful, but actually is good. So, anyways, he goes on. Here's another didactic little story. There are these two guys sitting together in a bar in the remote Alaskan wilderness. One of the guys is religious, the other is an atheist, and the two are arguing about the existence of God with that special intensity that comes after about the fourth beer. And the atheist says, "Look, it's not like I don't have actual reasons for not believing in God. It's not like I haven't ever experimented with the whole God and prayer thing. Just last month, I got caught away from the camp in that terrible blizzard, and I was totally lost. I couldn't see a thing, and it was 50 below. And so I tried it. I fell to my knees in the snow and cried out, 'Oh God, if there is a God, I'm lost in this blizzard. I'm going to die if you don't help me.' And now, in the bar, the religious guy looks at the atheist all puzzled. 'Well, then you must believe now,' he says. 'After all, here you are, alive.' The atheist just rolls his eyes. 'No, man, all that was a couple of Eskimos happened to come wandering by and shoved me the way back to camp.'" It's easy to run this story through kind of a standard liberal arts analysis. The exact same experience can mean two totally different things to two different people, given those people's two different belief templates and two different ways of constructing meaning from experience. Because we prize tolerance and diversity of belief, nowhere in our liberal arts analysis do we want to claim that one guy's interpretation is true, the other guy's is false or bad, which is fine, except we also never end up talking about just where these individual templates and beliefs come from, meaning where they come from inside the two guys, as if a person's most basic orientation towards the world and the meaning of his experience were somehow just hardwired, like height or shoe size, or automatically absorbed from the culture like language, as if how we construct meaning were not actually a matter of personal, intentional choice. Plus, there's a whole matter of arrogance. The non-religious guy is so totally certain in his dismissal of the possibility that the passing Eskimo had anything to do with his prayer for help. True, there are plenty of religious people who seem arrogant and certain of their own interpretations too. They're probably even more repulsive than atheists, at least to most of us. But religious dogmatists' problem is exactly the same as the story's unbeliever: blind certainty, a closed-mindedness that amounts to an imprisonment so total that the prisoner doesn't even know he's locked up.
Yeah. We were talking before about the Derrida quote that there is nothing outside of the text, meaning that there's an infinite number of interpretations of a given text. And this is something that I don't know much about, but I've always loved that quote because, at least as it stands sort of out of context, it presents to me the idea that anyone can get whatever it is that they bring to the table out of whatever it is that you're examining. And so a given circumstance, like with the Eskimos, or a given text, and I think you and I deal with the Bible probably primarily when it comes to interpretations with people. And I just know that there are a lot of people, everybody talks about it, but everybody talks about the sort of platitudinal reading of Scripture. If you read it on a cross stitch, it's probably out of context, that sort of thing. I've heard that joke made in many sermons, and it's a good reference, it's a good way to examine what you're reading and what you're believing. And, oh, do I just believe this because it says I can do all things, and sort of that's where I stop paying attention and I don't understand the context of the verse. I think that what he's getting at here is really important, where we end up living such small lives in our own worlds that are defined by our interpretations and our understandings. And I think we feel safe there, which is so strange because obviously, even in the little parable, he gets caught in a blizzard, which is outside of his safe space, right? He can't interpret the blizzard away, but his prayer and the resultant deliverance, he can explain that away, sort of back within the confines of his personal interpretation of the world and the way it works. And so, I don't know, I think it's just an example of the need to be aware of what it is that you're bringing to the table with your interpretive framework and how it affects you. You know what I mean? Like, I think it would be difficult to prove to somebody that doesn't already willingly believe that God exists and created the world and all of that stuff, that those things are true. Because typically people mean materially, provably, propositionally true. And those things aren't, I mean, I don't know, there wouldn't be any questions about it if we had the access to that sort of data, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
people interpret a given scientific paper one way or another based on their pre-existing beliefs. If it were a creationist versus evolutionist debate, you could read the same text and walk away saying, well, that data seems a bit unstable, or, like depending on if you believe in the conclusion or not. And whether or not that's true or it's helpful or whatever, it's like that's just the way that two different people are going to walk away from the same event.
Yeah. And I think I like this is the paragraph where I would recognize the postmodern influence, but also checking it. Like, he kind of checks the postmodern worldview. And to define the term, I would say that postmodernism is. I haven't gone to any of the source material, so it's not something I'm all that well versed in. But from what I understand, postmodernism is more of a way to view other worldviews, and not necessarily a fleshed out worldview in and of itself. But there are some core tenets to the worldview. And one of them being that there is no objective reality. Humans are unable to actually arrive at any type of understanding of it, if it even exists at all. They can only describe what they see, but it's kind of like a Kantian thing that takes place in their reasoning, that your mental experience of a thing is now twice removed from the actual thing. And so because of that, you're never able to actually experience concrete reality. You only experience your experience of it. That makes sense. And so that goes into, there is no essence to a thing, or to a person even too. There's no identifiable uniqueness that makes it and constitutes it as unique or knowably unique. One of those two, like depends on how extreme you want to take the worldview. But the underlying premise, that's why he even says like it's easy to run this story through kind of standard liberal arts analysis. The exact same experience can mean two totally different things to two different people, giving those people's two different belief templates and two different ways of constructing meaning from experience. That's kind of appealing to the postmodern view on how to analyze worldviews and assertions that claims to truth. But he makes this assertion, which completely opposes the postmodern assertion, because another tenet of the postmodern assertion, if there's no essence to you as an individual, that means you are just a conglomeration of pretty much, this is why we get like identity politics, is you're a conglomeration of how you're born, right? If you're born white, you're born heterosexual, born a male, your social class, all these things make up who you are. And with that predisposes you to interpreting the world a certain way. And so you merely interpret your experiences like that because of these things that you're born into, and because of the language you speak too. That's another one that the postmodern heavily, and they're valid critiques too, by the way. I'm not saying this as a way of like trying and discredit, like these are valid critiques, but to sum up, that's why he says this. Because we prize tolerance and diversity of belief, nowhere in our liberal arts analysis do we want to claim that one guy's interpretation is true, the other guy's is false or bad, which is fine, and it's this right here, except we also never end up talking about just where these individual templates and beliefs come from, meaning where they come from inside the two guys, as if a person's most basic orientation towards the world and the meaning of his experience were somehow just hardwired, like height or shoe size, or automatically absorbed from the culture, like language. And so that's where he addresses the postmodern assertion that like the reason why you derive meaning from your experiences the way you do is because of the culture you're born into, and just the circumstances that you're born into. And he's kind of critiquing that by saying, well, actually, where you derive meaning from your experience, it comes from inside you. It's not an external thing. It's actually an internal thing, which a postmodern would never agree with.
Yeah. I want to raise two other things here. I'm not sure whether they're points or just factors, but one idea that I found very interesting recently comes from Chris Williamson. He's been talking about it for a year and a half on his podcast, probably. And I'll read it to you. It's basically this. He just is fascinated by two different types of ideas that are literally true but functionally false, and ideas that are literally false but functionally true. And so the example he gives is that a porcupine cannot actually throw its quills, but the idea that is literally false is functionally extremely pragmatic, because you're able to stay away from the porcupine, which if you were to get in some type of altercation with it, would cause you great harm. So it's effective in helping you navigate a world that porcupines exist within, but it is not literally true. They can't throw their quills. And so when it comes to sort of interpretive frameworks, I think it's important to understand that these things within us that we are sort of ingrained with are affecting whatever it is that we're believing. But then I guess this point is it's one more step removed, or wherever you want to put it. So it's like the atheist is believing something, and whether it's literally true or literally false is sort of beside the point. It's a matter of if it is functionally true or functionally false. And so when someone comes to an atheistic conclusion, and this isn't a podcast, a referendum on atheism, but you know, especially not atheism versus deism or theism, but how is the way that you're interpreting the world helping you or hurting you, right? How is it giving you life or taking life away from you, giving you the ability to live your life or taking that away from you? And I think that this is a good, simple way of looking at things. I guess when it comes to the existence of God or the reality, that the literal truth of God, people get pretty staunch in their defense. They get defensive, and so I don't mean that people need to back off of everything they believe to be literally true, but just when you're deciding whether or not something is important to you, it might be helpful to say, is this functionally true? Does this help me navigate the world, or does it not? Because then I think it allows for a little bit more of a live and let live situation. People go very Old Testament when it comes to other people's way of speaking about the thing that they believe to be the most important truth or reality. Of course, I don't know. The atheist has a reason. They usually have many reasons that they choose to live their life without the comfort of God as an ultimate being, originator of the universe, sustainer of the universe, and even more deeply a lover of their soul. And I think it stems from experience. But my point is, like, how is that working out for you? Like, do you ever would you ever consider benefiting from that, even if it weren't true, to just see maybe how true it actually is? How does that ring to you in this context?
I mean, it very much ties into the other tactic he uses to make his claims. That's why I brought up pragmatism earlier, because that's exactly what you're describing, which is like pragmatism. And also, there's a level of validity to that as well. I just took a logic class 2 semesters ago, and they were discussing there's now I'm blanking on the 2 categories. Goodness me. What is it when you are in the realm of logic and like the point of the argument is to necessitate the conclusion?
You mean like what's the other one? Inductive reasoning? Is that
inductive and deductive? Yes. Yeah. That's deductive. Is to the point of the argument is to guarantee the conclusion. But when it comes to induction, which is normally how science is conducted in the realm of induction, there's many things of like we could never deduce how to fly an airplane. Like we made these abstractions and then figured out that like once we do this, it's necessarily going to be true that we're going to take flight. And so even in the making of the airplane, that was a product of induction. Like there was so many factors I still didn't hammer out, but it worked. So that's a pretty good basis to claim that what they supposed was true, because it was true practically. It actually produced the result that they wanted, though they couldn't get a deductive argument as for how they're going to fly the plane. They induced through experimentation and hypothesizing and all that.
On this point, I think that a lot of religion, it would be my personal belief, a lot of Christianity even was inductive. And then my, again, personal belief is that Jordan Peterson does such a great job of formulating the deductive reasoning behind the sort of functional mechanisms of faith, and as much as is possible, because it's these are things that are hard to see and discuss. But I just wanted to throw that in there. I think that our lived experience is sort of like, well, it's inductive, and we don't necessarily have the means by which to deduce these things in a logical manner. But I guess Peterson's sort of testing the theory. I wonder if I, like how much I can deduct through careful reading and a lot of writing and thinking.
Yeah. And even thinking of that, like inducting, that means like you induce the meaning to the argument, which is very relevant to what we're talking about right now. And so, yeah, pragmatism is practical. But I would say the limitations is like for that to be the dictating logic to your decision making, in terms of like, will this benefit me, or even like kind of like what you said earlier, it's like, will this induce living or will this induce death? And it's like, well, even like your framework of what you define as living and death goes into how you can conclude which was more pragmatic. It's like, well, picking up my cross and dying daily, that doesn't sound as beneficial as doing whatever I want.
Yeah, right.
So that's the critique I would say for pragmatism. Like, it's useful. It's a good tool to have in your tool belt.
Yeah.
Just like postmodernism, just like idealism.
It's sort of
just like
definitionally useful.
In general.
Yeah,
No, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, I think with this, one of the major points of this paragraph was not only the critique of maybe even he's appealing to the audience, because this is an audience that is brought up in a liberal arts, obviously the graduating college. And so he's kind of like, it's easy to run the story through kind of a standard liberal arts analysis. So he's already kind of understand the audience, trying to appeal to, like, when you first hear this is probably how you're thinking of it. But then he concludes that paragraph. The non-religious guy is so totally certain in his dismissal of the possibility that the passing eskimo had anything to do with his prayer for help. True, there are plenty of religious people who seem arrogant and certain of their own interpretations too. They're probably even more repulsive than atheists, at least to most of us. But religious dogmatists' problem is exactly the same as a story's unbeliever: blind certainty, a closed-mindedness that amounts to an imprisonment so total that the prisoner doesn't even know how he's locked up, or know he's locked up, which is also a really interesting thing to tie into what is water. He's now describing a prison that they don't even recognize as a prison. This type of certainty and arrogance in their knowledge. And so I think that was a powerful way of being able to blend the two. It's like, that's why I liked how fresh it was. It wasn't just like a what's the word for it? Like what is it called when like you're using an argument in order to like provoke controversy in the person who's opposing your view? It's like it's normally used in apologetics. Like you're doing this to get a rise out of the opposing views holder. It's kind of like a shock factor, but it's also like very provocative. I don't remember what the word is, but he doesn't really like stoop to that level of like, he expresses his critique of postmodernism while also recognizing the validity in such a concise and compassionate way that I thought was really refreshing.
Yeah, he really is an excellent thinker, writer, speaker. It inspired me to sort of follow up on more of his writing and thinking, because I, like you, was not familiar with him really outside of the context of this commencement speech. I did just happen across a quote of his somebody else was reading, and that too was insightful and well written. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so anyways, to carry on, the point here is that I think this is one part of what teaching me how to think is really supposed to mean: to be just a little less arrogant, to have just a little critical awareness about myself and my certainties. Because a huge percentage of the stuff that I tend to be automatically certain of is, it turns out, totally wrong and diluted. I have learned this the hard way, as I predict you graduates will too. Here's just one example of the total wrongness of something I tend to be automatically sure of. Everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute certain or center of the universe, the realest, most vivid, and important person in existence. We rarely think about this sort of natural, basic self-centeredness because it's so socially repulsive, but it's pretty much the same for all of us. It's our default setting, hardwired into our boards at birth. I think that's probably brains, but it says boards on the transcript. Think about it. There is no experience you have had that you are not the absolute center of. The world as you experience it is there in front of you or behind you, to the left or right of you, on your TV or your monitor, and so on. Other people's thoughts and feelings have to be communicated to you somehow, but your own are so immediate, urgent, and real. I think this is another really central claim to the message that also kind of pokes at the. It's weird. It's like he's poking at like making the claim that like the real point of education is to help us not be so arrogant in our certainties. But then he's also like, by giving an example of a certainty that is natural to us, which is our self-centeredness, it's also like evoking like you ought to be certain in how untrustworthy your certainty is. And that's like a unifying human experience, which is a good way to help with the postmodern argument that like, oh, that's just your interpretation, that's just my interpretation. It's like, no, there is a universal aspect to the human experience, and one of it is selfishness, like which I mean the Bible argues a lot too. That's the key thing of like original sin.
Sure. And I think that maybe what we're getting at is that postmodernism or any other interpretive framework, like we said, it's not necessarily a philosophy, but a way to look at other philosophies. They fall short when placed in the seat of supremacy. When you look at it as the end-all be-all, it ends up revealing its flaws, which is good because you sort of need to test the theory to its limits, right? But then maybe what people tend to do is sort of dispense with a theory if it doesn't fit, if it doesn't have the capabilities to be that supreme theory. And I think that's unwise. And what I prefer to do in my own life, I hope, is to be able to claim what is good from a philosophy or interpretive framework and then move on. You know, there's a phrase in I don't know, a phrase I've heard in the South when it comes to reading other people's interpretations of scripture, sort of like biblical commentaries or whatever. They'll say, chew the meat and spit out the bones. And so you gain what's useful from whatever it is that you're discussing, and then you dispense with what is not useful. You don't throw the whole thing out, you know? And that is, I believe, an extremely beneficial tactic, right? Because you want to benefit from any and everything that you're spending your time on. It's much more efficient to benefit from something than to simply encounter it, identify it as false in some sense, and then disregard it as entirely false because it's not entirely true. And I don't know what that's sort of a teetotal, stance on, it's absolute truth or something like that. And so,
your microphone is glitching out.
Okay. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. Where were we?
You were talking about chewing the meat, spitting out the bones, and something about teetotalers' view on. You didn't finish the word.
Just truth.
The not being willing to.
Not being willing to consider the multiple interpretations and the value in them. Because I guess I'm comfortable in assuming, like, this seems so intuitive. I don't know. It seems so obvious to me, which, it's my interpretive. What's the way that he puts it? I've said interpretive framework too many times, but just like the way that is built into us to look at it. But anyway, when you're dealing with the world, it seems to me fairly self-evident that you are encountering something that's happening. What you need to understand is that you don't understand it fully. And so then it's only beneficial when somebody raises another perspective. Only. And to dismiss other perspectives because of a false aspect, I think, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You lose a significant portion of what the other person and their perspective has to offer you and your limited perspective. A helpful way that I've learned to think of it, and learned is a bit of a stretch. That would mean I incorporate it. But a way that I've heard it put is to, know what you don't know, or something, know that you don't know everything. You need to think of just a simple math problem, essentially. What do you know? And then think about how many things are outside of what it is that you know. And then just compare the two. So what are you going to rely on? The fact that you probably know the answer to your problem, or that the answer to your problem lies in that vast sea of potential answers and skills and bits of knowledge that are outside of you. Like you have to live your life with an understanding that there are more things that you don't know than things that you know. And if you can do that, then it sets you up well, I think, to encounter oppositional views without being completely flipped around or submerged in a sea of doubt, etc.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the thought of being willing to chew, no matter what the perspective is coming from, and not just right off the bat, like, oh, you're of that flavor. I'm not even gonna try it. I already know. Of course, I mean, I don't know. It's really easy to overgeneralize, especially when you're in this frame of thinking. I'm sure I can find examples of, like, yeah, I don't want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not because of, like, I don't believe that. The point I'm trying to make is that it's a matter of recognizing the dignity that's innate in every single human being. And it is a compassionate thing of, like, literally compassion is like, I want to experience the passion that you have. I want to be in that with you. And so it's like a validation of, like, whatever passion that is, I believe there is at least an ounce of importance just because you're a human being.
Yeah.
And so if you're passionate about a thing, like, I'm willing to experience that with you, as much as if you're actually asking me to do that. There's other instances where it's like, you don't actually want to share this passion with me. You just want to destroy my passion. So it has to be an honest, good faith conversation, of course. But for you to not be willing to do that, it's actually you who's lacking compassion. And I think that's where the religious dogma is contrasted with the Bible. That religious dogma of not being willing to be compassionate with other people who have differing views or perspectives, and to just assert, like, oh, it's not in keeping with the Bible. There's no value.
More
to
importantly,
it
it's not in keeping with my interpretation of the Bible. Right. That's never admitted to, but that is, of course, what is happening at that moment.
Yeah. And so that's why even this whole entire writing is very much that, because like there's so much in here that's like, wow, it was beautiful and insightful. And though it's not coming from a Christian perspective, like this is edifying in my life and even in my relationship with Jesus. It's
Yeah.
very multifaceted because it is very
Yes.
human.
And what you're saying about the sort of sovereignty of every individual person is reminding me of I can't remember whatever. I'll claim it. I'm sure I'm not the first person to think this, but I really do believe that when it comes to God, each person has a role to play in defining him. And you define him by your relationship with him, your experience of him, and then your interpretation of your experience, and you try to share that with other people, and you commiserate about the things that you don't like, and you celebrate the things that it is that you do appreciate about the person of God that you're interacting with. And when it's one of the great tragedies of sin and separation from God is there are so many people not contributing to this view of God. He's not just some static being that exists and you can learn all that there is to know about him, but he can be eternally fleshed out. And it's not, you don't create him, but you interact with new and different and undiscovered parts of him and share that with other people. And I don't know if that sounds reasonable to most Christians or any Christians or whatever, but maybe you can give me a little reaction to what I'm saying. But I think it's so fundamental to what I believe that I want to know what people think about God and how they've interacted with him. I guess I don't just outright believe everything that everyone says. I don't feel like I'm in danger of someone else. Well, I guess we're all in danger of someone else misrepresenting God, but I guess I don't think that I limit someone's personal experience of God and the way that they share it with me outright. Well, I didn't read that, so I don't believe you.
Yeah.
I do. I
Yeah.
guess what I'm butting up against in my head right now is a lot of people take solace in the fact that they can sort of bounce experiences off of the holy scriptures and their authoritative understanding of the way that things are and the character of God. And I guess when things are inconsistent with that, that might be a good grounds for pause and deeper consideration or dismissal of the whatever trait it is that someone has proposed. But I guess to do it sort of prematurely might be people's tendency. Again, we talked about this before, but it's hard to think for yourself all the time. And so there's a peace that comes in, the ignorance is bliss. There's a bliss that comes with just, nope, not thinking about that. I don't read it that way, and I don't want to think about it more than, 5 seconds. And this is what we're working with. So,
Yeah. I would say it's impossible to think for yourself
at all
Like,
times, yes.
life is, well, just in general, it's like life is designed to be a collaborative effort. Like you need community, and that community shapes how you view, and that's a hard. That's exactly what the reaction to the postmodern thing is. I think that's what it's a result to, as a reaction to a lot of the atrocities that were done in the name of ideology in the First and Second World Wars, primarily the Second World War, because of the way that they utilize these meta narratives to bolster their own grip on power to then create monstrous acts against society. And it's because they had this meta narrative, a meta narrative being like a God's eye view on the world to explain the world. That's the other core tenet of postmodernism, is that there is no meta narrative. There's no, like, meta narratives are not a reality, they're a social construct. And so it's an understandable one because it's like to have to be humbled with swallowing the hard pill that like I need my community in order to actually grow and understand. Um, and if that was all that there was, if there was no room for divine revelation, this is my other point to what you're talking about. I'll get there, but if that'd be terrifying if there was no room for the reality of divine revelation. Because if it was just like natural revelation, then yeah, it's like that's just your culture against my culture's experience and history of anthropological interpretations of different natural phenomenon and how we both experience this phenomenon and then explain the phenomenon and then cultivate a meta narrative that helps us orient and explain all of the phenomena of the world. Yeah, that's terrifying. For reasons such as, I mean, it's not even just World War I and II, like all throughout history. Like that is a good critique that like meta narratives are utilized and have historically been utilized in very disastrous ways, even the Christian one. And there's no ideology that's like free from that critique. There's no meta narrative that's free from that critique. I think every meta narrative has been utilized in some abominable way by some society in one point in history or another. And so, yeah, I guess it begs the question: like, is it because there's no such thing as meta narratives, or is it because of even what he's talking about right now in this speech? You know, it's like there is also this innate way that we naturally orient ourselves in the world if it's not checked by culture or checked by some external force that keeps us from believing that, oh yeah, I'm not the center of the universe. Like it does take an external force for you to recognize that. So either all narratives are not wrong, or there is this aspect to human nature that causes you to, if it's not checked, this aspect of your nature causes you to grow into a monster. And you'll utilize whatever you need to bolster your monstrous agenda. Which is interesting because then it's not even about meta narrative at that point. Like it could be anything. You can use anything to bolster your agenda, to do whatever you want to do, to wield power or oppress. You know, like that's a lot of the postmodern thing too. It's like very much influenced by the Marxist idea that like history can be defined by a struggle of the haves and the have-nots, and it's an economic struggle. And throughout these economic evolutions, there's been this ominous discrepancy of power that needs to be corrected with justice, you know. So there's the oppressed and the oppressor, and we know what the oppressor's tools are, and that's always meta narratives and ideologies. And so therefore, what now we need to create a meta narrative so that we can like Hammurabi's code, like eye for an eye, like give them a taste of their own medicine. Like that's the, I mean, I think that's what we're seeing in culture. But again, I'm sure there's very many nuances to postmodern expressions that aren't just that. So, anyways, in terms of also what you're talking about, I think you're right in recognizing like with the divine revelation, like God also tells us who He is too. Like it wasn't like an anthropological evolution or understanding, though it was that as well. I think too. Like there's both. There's both. Yeah. In it. I think that's what you're getting at.
And it's important. It's important to know that because they inform one another, and so what we understand divine revelation to be is also backed up by experience of the divine revealer, right?
But it's also checked by what He's already
yes, right, himself. Because we can misinterpret.
Actually gives you a metric.
I'm thinking of Job. That was the first example. Like this is a cruel God that hates me and doesn't know what He's doing, and you know, there's an important nuance there. Or even Cain and Abel. I'm reading We Who Wrestle with God, and Peterson talks extensively about his theory that Cain is attempting to claim that there is no fault in him, but there is fault in the way the world is set up to work. And I think that that's an important aspect of God, is that the world is created according to him. He created it, is one way of saying that, a simple way of saying that. But that means that it was created according to him. And so then it adheres to the principles of God. It isn't God, but there are ways of observing the universe that detail his character. And so when it comes to the meta-narratives of postmodernism, Marxism has crept in there, and that was sort of what you were talking about with the socioeconomic or economic revolutions and all of that. Like, to subject God to judgment based on his flaws and not our own is to ignore the fact that we have that propensity to take a meta-narrative and wield it against the people that we don't like, and, essentially original sin. And I think that rather than doing that and complaining, there's another path forward that God has extended his hand to take us along, and that is cooperation. And most people that don't believe in God or reject him, if they do believe in him in some way, they opt for that sort of critical stance on the way that he has designed things. And I think he's doing pretty good, for a functional world for X amount of years, however far someone wants to go back. It's very impressive. And just look at any of the natural environments and the people that have invented things and spoken things. And I mean, it's illimitable, the positive results of what God has created.
Yeah. And so I like that he addresses like how much our certainty can limit us from experiencing reality.
Yes. He very succinctly put what we just discussed for half an hour.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, well, I'll read the next thing. He says, please don't worry that I'm getting ready to lecture you about compassion or other directedness or all the so-called virtues. This is not a matter of virtue. It's a matter of my choosing to do the work of somehow altering or getting free of my natural hardwired default setting, which is so deeply and literally self-centered, and to see and interpret everything through this lens of self. People who can adjust their natural default settings this way are often described as being, quote, well-adjusted, which I suggest to you is not an accidental term. Given the triumphant academic setting here, an obvious question is how much of this work of adjusting our default setting involves actual knowledge or intellect? It's actually a very good question. This question gets very tricky. Probably the most dangerous thing about an academic education, at least in my own case, is that it enables my tendency to intellectualize stuff, to get lost in abstract argument inside my head instead of simply paying attention to what is going on right in front of me, paying attention to what is going on inside of me. So I like that. Also, the other side of the critique too is that like what constitutes good education is not necessarily found in more knowledge or a broadened intellect. He's saying there's like another aspect to what constitutes good education, and it has something to do. He doesn't really identify it, but it has something to do with your ability to recognize, and to also discipline yourself to pay attention to what is going on in front of you and inside of you. I thought that was an interesting assertion.
Yeah. Say more about that.
Well, I think even that is like addressing how philosophies can hurt you, and like if you put too much emphasis on trying to bolster a philosophy or even create one or innovate one, it like almost misses the point to life. That the point of life isn't necessarily to find explanations to phenomenon, but it's actually to be able to um, truly be able to recognize phenomenon as they happen. And those phenomenons aren't just physical ones, but there's also an inner. So it's almost like he's addressing like a spiritual element to it as well. He doesn't use those terms, and he does kind of later on. But even his way of like dancing on this whole thing of like, seems like he's in. I don't know much about his worldview, but it seems like he too is uncomfortable with the uh, contemporary view of metaphysical reality and transcendental aspects of even individuals, that like we are soul, we are spirit. Because even his like trying to appease the maybe the knee-jerk reaction to a secular liberal art mind is like, please don't worry that I'm getting ready to lecture you about compassion or other kindness or the so-called virtues. It's like, well, this isn't like that normal contemporary spiritual religious dogmatic talk. But at the same time, he's addressing the value that can be found there in a way that is also in keeping with a sort of skeptic relative um, flavor to it. But the assertion that it's not due to intellectual prowess that you can properly orient yourself in the world is actually due to a more, it sounds like he would probably say more human, more compassionate ability to actually recognize when meaningful phenomenon happens right now, and not just like trying to get lost in abstraction, but truly be cemented into what you're experiencing.
So much of what would you call it? People attempting to live out what they abstractly believe to be true comes down to that question of, how do I get it from my head to my heart? How do I get it so that my initial reaction to something is properly constrained by what I believe to be an appropriate reaction to a situation? You know, I'm thinking compassion for a child that is frustrating their parent. The parent is upset with themselves because they've been trying and they're putting in a lot of effort, and they feel justified in their anger towards their child. But if only they were able to take that compassionate angle, then they would be able to live the way that they believe is the best way to live. And so being able to practically implement what they believe is the difficulty. This comes about in the Christian realm as well, probably just extensively is what I want to say. And I don't know. I think that there is a bit of working that it takes to get it from just something that you think to be true to something that you experience to be true. And there's a conscious choice that we all have in those moments. It's like, it's something he's about to go on to say, but that you have the ability to choose how you think about something, and how you think about it is the way that you're going to interact with it. And you can't just go through life with a sort of Spock perspective on everything. That, you know, if I'm rationally and logically oriented in this situation, I would respond as follows. And that isn't how the situations arise. They often catch you off guard. You haven't eaten, you haven't slept, you're out of sorts. And the issue becomes who it is that you are behind or beneath all of those things. But I think that sort of has to do with what it is that you believe to be true about everything that you're dealing with. If you think that the most important thing is to be full or well rested or treated fairly or what have you, then you will end up being slighted at some point or having to stay up all night with a crying baby or not being able to stop for lunch. And then you'll be caught in this situation where what you think is the most important in a given moment isn't, and yet that's the worldview that you're operating according to. And so then you feel justified in your lack of compassion or your rise of anger or whatever you have that you normally wouldn't say is optimal for your, it doesn't give you the consequence that you desire, but because of a set of circumstances, it leads you to justify your behavior in one way or another. And I think this goes back to sin as it's first described in Genesis 1 or 3. They don't work through all of that in the text, but it's sort of implied that Adam and Eve kind of come to the conclusion with the help of the snake that, it really isn't right that they can't eat from the tree. They really should eat from the tree. That probably would be the best way to do that. And so it's a it's a reassessment of the situation. Okay, according to how I feel now, I don't know that I actually do trust that this God or be like supreme ultimate being really is the source of wisdom, knowledge, what is true, what is real. And I guess when we're talking about this, the whole thing's called This is Water. We want to know what water is so that we can swim, so that we can navigate it properly, right? And so, anyway, I think that we struggle to implement what it is that we think abstractly to be true because of what we believe to be actually true.
What was the last statement? You said that like our certainty in reality prevents us, is something like the certainty of our reality prevents us from experiencing actual reality. Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a direct quote from the piece, but what I was saying is that what we believe to be true in the abstract, we struggle to implement it because we believe something else at a deeper level. So we can abstractly assent to something, but not implement it because it's sort of irrelevant to our immediate experience.
Yeah. Hence the default modality. Like,
yes.
There's a deeper presupposition that informs our actions, and it's not our intellectual abstraction. It's more of a heart, guttural, subconscious thing. If we actually are attentive and honest with ourselves, is like there's actually a deeper, a philosophical assertion that informs my activity when I'm not consciously choosing to live out what I believe.
I think his next paragraph has a lot to do with that.
Yeah. As I'm sure you guys know by now, it is extremely difficult to stay alert and attentive instead of getting hypnotized by the constant monologue inside your own head. 20 years after my own graduation, I have come gradually to understand that the liberal arts cliche about teaching you how to think is actually shorthand for a much deeper, more serious idea. Learning how to think really means learning how to exercise some control over how and what you think. It means being conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to and to choose how you construct meaning from experience. Because if you cannot exercise this kind of choice in adult life, you'll be totally hosed. Think of the old cliche about the mind being an excellent servant but a terrible master. This, like many cliches, so lame and unexciting on the surface, actually expresses a great and terrible truth. It is not the least bit coincidental that adults who commit suicide with firearms almost always shoot themselves in the head. They shoot the terrible master, and the truth is that most of these suicides are actually dead long before they pull the trigger. And I submit that this is what the real no bullshit value of your liberal arts education is supposed to be about. How to keep from going through your comfortable, prosperous, respectable adult life dead, unconscious, a slave to your head and to your natural default setting of being uniquely and completely, imperially alone day in and day out. They may sound like hyperbole or abstract nonsense. Let's get concrete. Plain fact is that you graduating seniors do not yet have any clue what day in, day out really means. There happens to be whole large parts of adult American life that nobody talks about in commencement speeches. One such part involves boredom, routine, and petty frustration. The parents and older folks here will know all too well what I'm talking about. I like that he brings to the table the existential crisis of adult life as well. I think it kind of further proves the whole, what I'm about to say is a matter of life and death.
Yeah, he's setting it up because, well, he set it up in the beginning, and then he touches on it there by saying the truth is that most of these suicides are actually dead long before they pull the trigger. I think that, to me, that speaks of agency and your ability to choose not being realized. If you don't think that you can choose, then what is the point of your life? That's how I would say it. I work at a cafe, and I have a coworker and a boss who are much more content with sort of deterministic, Calvinistic views that I don't know. I've softened on my harsh, rejection of them. I guess sort of eating crow here. In a podcast, I just said that I try to chew the meat, but I guess that's what I mean. I've been listening to them, and that's interesting, and that I'm fascinated that is your experience, because I don't find that to be true in my own life. I think that so much of what actualizes our potential as image bearers of God is our ability to choose. God chooses a lot of things all the time. And it's super fascinating to read with that sort of lens on the scripture, that he is choosing things for good reasons, and yeah, a lot of people have a hard time with.
He even checks aspects of his nature, like actively talking about. I was just reading a excerpt from Gentle and Lowly, and it was talking about how Scripture describes his need for justice and like to exact punishment for unrighteous conduct, as I think I forget what verse in Isaiah, but he calls it himself. God says that it is his strange work or his alien work. And so like even like there's a passage in Hosea where he just got done pretty much expressing the insults that Israel has conducted and inflicted on God, and he lists his grievances. But then he says, he gives this long expose, like, when Israel was a child, I raised them up, took them by the hand, and I've raised you since you were young, and now here you are denying me and disobeying me and rebelling against me. And he says, no, I will not destroy you. I will not inflict the wrath that I feel. I'm going to hold back my anger and my desire for justice. I'm going to show you mercy. And Gentle Lily was also talking about how there's aspects in Jeremiah where he describes how he will restore Israel and kind kind of like what we talked about in that other podcast not too long ago, that same section where he says, I will do that with my whole heart and my whole soul. But then when it comes to justice, there's like, he describes this type of inner working, inner choosing, and like checking an aspect of his nature, and another aspect of his nature takes more there's more light shed on another part of his nature, and he chooses to be merciful instead of just. But so even in that, like in God deliberately, he even goes into like a psychology, like he expresses the psychology of himself, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Of like, I have this motivation to inflict some type of punishment because of my wrath, but I'm also more motivated by my love, that instead of doing that thing, I'm going to instead show you mercy. And yeah, it's just really, really intriguing.
Yeah. That's why it's important to read your Bible.
Yeah.
Because what Wallace says is true. What he says is that the actual value of your liberal arts education is supposed to be how to keep going through your comfortable, prosperous, respectable adult life, dead, unconscious, a slave to your head, to your natural default setting of being uniquely, completely, imperially alone, day in and day out. And I think that is remarkably cruel and inhumane and just socially accepted. Like because that's the water that we've chosen to swim in or something. I don't know. I'm trying to adapt that there, but
it's just the water you drifted into because you didn't even know to swim, like that you could operate in the water to not get there.
It's so important to wake up and realize that this is what your environment consists of, because otherwise that's what you do. You know, he's speaking to people that have valued this for 4 years, if not more, the latter half of high school, you know, all through high school. Now I feel like 8th grade scores are contributing to whether or not someone gets into school. That's at least what I hear. I personally am not attempting to get into any liberal arts institution. And this was in 2000, 2002, 2005, something like that. And so very, very prescient of Wallace here to call it out and acknowledge, like, hey, this whole thing has been set up to kill you, and what you have the potential to do. And I think we're going to skip over it, but the next section, we'll put the link in the description so everybody can read it or listen to it for their own selves. But
I think you should.
It describes.
It's really good.
I definitely. It describes a normal, boring day in the life that everyone just subjects themselves to, and then suffers the consequences of their lack of agency. But it's sort of like you have agency, and you've chosen this path, and that's crazy. Even if you haven't chosen the path, the details, where it is that you are in your life, because of so many different circumstances. We've been talking about sort of postmodern beliefs about who's oppressed and what that means for their life. And I want to acknowledge, like, a lot of people don't get to choose just practically. They can't choose where they were born, or, you know, any of those things that you don't choose. And yet you have the ability to reframe. And that goes back to what's literally true and functionally false. It's literally true that you have been born into this situation, but it's functionally false to say, and so
such is life.
This is who I am. I think that reduces you in a way that's so detrimental to your life. Like, it kills you. It kills you. Because I believe that it's fundamentally or inherently human to be alive. Is that
true? And just to be able to cultivate out of whatever's at your disposal, something that is good.
Yeah.
I mean, you even see that that's part of the garden story. Like we were made to cultivate and steward the garden. It's like here's something to operate in. I've given you the ability to do beautiful things with it, and that's still true. Even though the fall is, I actually kind of want to go more into that too, with how relativism has to play and the choice thing. But well, we can get that more because he makes an assertion that ties into that. Um, but that's still true. That like yeah, you're born into a fallen world, but you are made in the image of God. That makes it so you have faculties and agencies that allow you to actually um, make something out of whatever you can get your hands on. Like you have a creative agency that is akin to God's agency of creative expression. And in fact, is informed by his creative expression, whether you know it or not. And if it's not well informed, then you could create hell for yourself, most certainly. Uh,
Yeah. Or a liberal arts system that crushes humanity.
yeah, and is a despot that that utilizes your creative ability for its own gain, while also draining you of your vitality. That's the American dream, baby. Whew. That's why postmodern critique and even Marxist critique are valid. I do want to like lay that out there. Like these critiques, it's like it's not like it's kind of like what you're talking about. Like they're half truths. And the best lies are half truths. It's like well, that's not the full picture. And that's the way he's touched on this too. Is like there's more to the story than just the unfairness of life, and that it's just circumstantial, and you can't necessarily choose what circumstances you are a product of. So therefore, because your life, you have to endure unfair things that are oppressive to you. That because you were born into such an unfair system, that there's nothing you can make out of it, and that it's meaningless. Um, and that it's a good challenge to a nihilistic take on the world that is not hard to come to. I think that's another thing too. I think a lot of times we bring up nihilism as such a buzzword. That's like, oh, that's just absurd. I can't understand how people get nihilistic, but it's like, well, most people who say that is people who don't have very much experience with suffering. Um, and so to disregard a nihilistic conclusion to the circumstances of life, uh, and to just paint it as uh, an expression of a weak mind or a weak something, or it doesn't really do justice to the fact that these people have valid reasons to. Because even Ecclesiastes recognize that. You know, Solomon said it's a tragic hand that God has dealt mankind. Like, uh, it's a toilsome endeavor, and so it's like, no, yeah, we are born into an unfair, broken, uh, trial-inducing existence, and so to not be able to be compassionate enough to actually validate the dignity of the human being who has come to the conclusion that their life is meaningless and it's futile, and why even go on? That's really because of your certainty of the contrary. Therefore, you're not willing to actually hear the heart that is bleeding, who holds such views. Um, and sadly, I think that's a very prominent view of our culture. Like, and the reason why this is so uh, it tickles the fancy of a lot is because of um, it is partly because they're born to a culture that tells them that, but it's also not wholly because that's also because of the effects that sin has on culture. And when a framework of how a meta narrative, let's say, is embraced by a culture that is so utterly contrary to God's design, i.e., you are made with the ability to cultivate and steward what you receive at birth, and even that is another way of even framing that reality. Like these are blessings. You can receive them at birth. It's not really like they're forced on you at birth. It's like it's actually an honor to be able to. Of course, it's easy to say that when uh, you know there's other people that are born in much worse circumstances than I was born. So of course I could say that because I was born in America in the class I was. But no, I don't think that is actually a proper critique. I think it's like um, it's due to the fact that I've embraced a worldview that actually gives room for redemption. And I think that's even what he's kind of talking about here. Like there's a redeeming element to the long example he gives to how you can either view this as unfair because of your default mode of thinking where you're so self-centered, or you can recognize that it could be sacred or meaningful and it could be redeemed in light of another framework on how you can actually choose to think about things. And so I love that he just speaks to such a relevant issue. You could tell he actually himself has suffered through a lot, and I don't know much about David Foster Wallace's story, but I know that he suffered greatly with depression to the point where he actually eventually did commit suicide. So even him saying that, like, this is how you don't get to the point where you swallow a barrel of a gun. That those words weren't just like, hyperbole. Like that's something I think he believed himself. Like this is what he's even helping me not end it all in my day-to-day adult life. Because I recognize I have a choice in the matter.
Yeah. If you want to continue on, if you go past the part where it says you get the idea, skip the next paragraph, and then I think you can start there. That the thing is that, of course. And just by way of summary, he details in great length a demoralizing trip to the supermarket and then sitting in traffic and the frustrations all around you. And you can look at the various people or vehicles around you and think that they're ruining the world. And he sums it up by saying that if I choose to think this way in a store and on the freeway, fine. Lots of us do. Except thinking this way tends to be so easy and automatic that it doesn't have to be a choice. It is my natural default setting. It's the automatic way that I experience the boring, frustrating, crowded parts of adult life when I'm operating on the automatic, unconscious belief that I am the center of the world and that my immediate needs and feelings are what should determine the world's priorities. The thing is that, of course, there are totally different ways to think about these kinds of situations. In this traffic, all these vehicles stopped and idling in my way. It's not impossible that some of these people in SUVs have been in horrible auto accidents in the past and now find driving so terrifying that their therapist has all but ordered them to get a huge, heavy SUV so they can feel safe enough to drive. Or that the Hummer that just cut me off is maybe being driven by a father whose little child is hurt or sick in the seat next to him, and he's trying to get his kid to the hospital, and he's in a bigger, more legitimate hurry than I am. It is actually I who am in his way. Or I can choose to force myself to consider the likelihood that everybody else in the supermarket checkout line is just as bored and frustrated as I am, and that some of these people probably have harder, more tedious, and painful lives than I do. Again, please don't think that I'm giving you moral advice or saying that I'm saying that you are supposed to think this way or that anyone expects you to just automatically do it, because it's hard and it takes will and effort. And if you are like me, some days you won't be able to do it or you just flat out won't want to. But most days, if you're aware enough to give yourself a choice, you can choose to look differently at this fat, dead-eyed, over-makeup lady who just screamed at her kid in the checkout line. Maybe she's not usually like this. Maybe she's been up 3 straight nights holding the hand of a husband who's dying of bone cancer. Or maybe this very lady is just a low-wage clerk at the motor vehicle department who just yesterday helped your spouse resolve a horrific, infuriating red tape problem through some small act of bureaucratic kindness. Of course, none of this is likely, but it's also not impossible. It just depends on what you want to consider. If you're automatically sure that you know what reality is, and you're operating on your default setting, then you, like me, probably won't consider possibilities that aren't annoying and miserable. But if you really learn how to pay attention, then you will know there are other options. It will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell type situation as not only meaningful, but sacred, on fire with the same force that made the stars, love, fellowship, the mystical oneness of all things deep down. Not that that mystical stuff is necessarily true. The only thing that's capital T true is that you get to decide how you're going to see this.
And the last thing, this I submit is the freedom of a real education. Learn how to be well adjusted. You get to consciously decide what has meaning and what doesn't. You get to decide what to worship.
It's so good. So good. The whole of Scripture is about what it is that you decide to worship. I think that gets dismissed out of hand because it is not something we think about anymore. So in our culture, we don't, categorically worship our idols. We worship God or Allah or whomever. And other than that, the other things that we worship tend not to be in the same category. So then we struggle to see them as even remotely contemporaries of God. So we say, oh, I don't worship God. Well, then you worship something. That's an assertion that you hear from a lot of believers in God, and it comes off as stale or something like, okay, not really. I actually don't. I don't tithe to Nike or whatever. Not the God, the company, ironically. But yeah, I think it's so key to identify that in anyone's life, even if you are someone that doesn't believe in the God that James and I have been speaking of. It's like you have to be aware of the fact that you devote yourself to whatever it is that you think is most important.
Yeah, and what you decide is most important opens up different possibilities for your mind to work. And the root of worship is, if I'm not mistaken, it's literally worthship, like how worthy, how much worth you actually deem this entity to have. And obviously, if you deem it as very valuable, you're willing to do great things for that thing that you decide is worthy of your worship. And so it's really interesting to bring that into perspective too. Like what you're worshiping dictates how your mind operates and allows your mind to consider different, like whole different array and realms of possibilities. And so he goes into some of what we are going to read, but just to put that there too is like that's a good metric to gauge how worthy your object of worship is. It's like, is your object of worship causing you to be so closed-minded that you're actually hurting people or yourself? Or is it enabling you to consider things in ways that is actually pragmatically beneficial and effective. Not that that's the only metric, but that is a good one. It's like if it's money, I'm not really gonna consider being selfless, um, because I don't get money from that. And that's what I deem as most worthy of my devotion. So why would I be selfless when I don't get more money for doing that? Um, and you give more and more examples, but um, the object of your worship causes you to conform to a certain pattern of behavior, and a certain pattern of thought, which is why it's a pattern of behavior, because really your behavior is a product of your mental reality. Um, that's why Scripture talks about do not be transformed to the ways of the world, or do not be conformed to the ways of the world, be transformed through the renewing of your mind. It's really all has to do with the mind. Um,
Yeah, it's occurring to me right now that uh, we live in a world that's sufficiently atomized. We're disconnected enough to assume that our whims do not impact other people, which is strange because I think the assumption is that they do not impact ourselves. Again, strange because we want to do whatever it is that our whim is because of its impact on us. we appreciate the experience. And so if we think that's true, that what we desire in a given moment doesn't have an effect on other people, I think we're more likely to assume that it's okay and it doesn't impact the world's priorities. That was the phrase he used earlier. And so why wouldn't everything be determined? Why wouldn't the world's priorities be determined on our whims? Is sort of the conclusion of that. Like, why wouldn't the world be set up in such a way that I get to do whatever I want to do? And I guess with the mind that I have developed or been given or whatever through my life experiences, I am I'm having a lot of red flags, like that's all bad stuff and you should do what God wants you to do. But the reason that that's true and that your subjective whim is not sufficient is because it's not true that it doesn't affect anyone else. And so if you took the whole scope of the 7-8 billion people on the planet into view, your moment of hedonic pleasure or whatever, it doesn't have to be weird and freaky, it just whatever you want to do in the moment,
yeah,
is affecting other people because it's affecting you. And I think that has to do with your relationship with God. And there was a moment earlier when we were talking about this, and I can't remember the passage in the speech or what you said. Something made me think about this, that it's so insane to me that people can be compelled to live this death of a life because that's what's dead, your ability to relate with other people. And so you still have the ability, but you choose to live as though you don't, and that is what death represents in this case, that you do not embrace the full and total capacity of your human self to interact with other people because of the inconvenience, it seems, like if it is yourself that you worship or anything that is lesser than the ultimate good or God, then you end up in these tributaries of the path of life where it's like, okay, this is a dead end. I'm now in stagnant water, dying because I'm alone, and And the aloneness, it was this. He talks about how it trains you to be alone day in and day out. And that is a horrible place for a person to be, because we're designed, I think, to interact relationally. There's some stuff, we'll probably talk about it at some point on the podcast. There's some stuff by John Vervaeke about the relational fact of reality that it's so interesting, so interesting, because it's so easy to take the perspective that Wallace was talking about earlier, that it's all about you. You experience the world as all about you. It happens to you. You do things to the world. You are the main character, but that main character syndrome, I've heard it called, it's like, it is, I don't know, it's pervasive and destructive, and it's preyed upon by the consumer hell that he was talking about. It's cultivated in us. And I think that if you allow yourself to swim in those waters because of your ignorance, then you end up suffering much worse consequences than if you try to maybe swim upstream or something. Like you need to be fighting back. Oh, this is actually a good quote. I don't know who to attribute it to, but I heard it through John Mark Comer. He says that you need to fight back against the culture with the same intensity that it fights for you, because you're a commodity to the culture. You are useful to your culture. And so in order to establish yourself as, maybe someone who's aware of your environment, it takes effort, it takes will, and it takes effort.
Or like the Matrix would put it, you're a battery for the simulacrum of reality.
Precisely.
That's right.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yes. The original title for the podcast was The Matrix.
The Matrix, of course. My favorite movie of
that
all
was
time.
taken.
Yeah. But yeah, no, the fact that I like that you touched that. You're a commodity for, any type of attempt for utopia. Because, I think that even highlights the fact that you, as a person made the image of God, you have very, 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 very valuable, let's say powers, because that sounds exciting. And those powers are necessary to bolster any type of claim for truth in whatever reality it's trying to shape. Even the Christian one, on earth as it is in heaven. I think every major worldview is attempting to bring that about. And it takes unity and it takes humans for that to be actually, and, I'm sure now I'm going to have a bunch of really, really well-informed, reformed people coming out of my head for like, God doesn't need humanity. That's not really, I'm not
I think he chooses to need them because he is the essentially relational being that we're modeled after.
Yeah.
Right. So when we're talking about the necessity of community in our lives, we actually do need, but he chooses to exist. Well, he does exist in relationship with himself in three persons or something like that. That's an extremely confusing reality. But then because of that, everything is modeled on that principle of choosing to serve, give, love another, the other.
And utilize the capabilities and powers I have to affect my reality in cultivating something. It's a creative endeavor.
Yeah. Something you just said reminded me of the as above, so below. That is the proper order of things. As it is in the highest, most virtuous sense, that is the way that it is best for it to be below, which would be like earth or whatever. But that, I don't know if this is the case, but it either comes from Paradise Lost, and it's an inversion of what Satan says, Milton Satan says, as below, so above. And that is the problem with the assertion that we control what the highest reality is. That's the dominance and oppression of a metaphysical or a meta narrative. We are creating the reality, and then like dictating it to other people, and that isn't right. That will always end in millions of deaths, as the 20th century has indicated.
Yeah. Some deep stuff. I like that he even touches on this too. Like, it'll actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow consumer hell type situation. It's not only meaningful, but sacred, on fire with the same force that made the stars. Love, fellowship, the mystical oneness of all things deep down. And you can dissect a lot of that, especially the mystical oneness of all things deep down. But that's for another podcast. I don't think that's really necessary to break down. But I love that he talks about actually having the power to sanctify something, like to make it sacred, to repurpose it for, to serve something glorious. That's interesting. I think that's true. I think that's the interesting thing about the postmodern critique too, because there is an element in talking about the powers of humans and the creative agency that we have. We do have the ability to make something sacred, not in the sense of like, we can find that in Christian doctrine of like what is essentially sacred, which there is an ideal, and then there's a representation of sacredness that is like a cheap imitation or repurposing. Like, in a biblical context, what's truly sacred is it's serving God's glory. But practically speaking, this isn't wrong. Like, you are able to make something. That's how you can even have idols. You can make something sacred. You can cultivate and infuse meaning. That also produces more and more meaning. Like, it's so crazy. Like, the fact that there are other worldviews, there are other religions, there are other liturgy, I think is evidence of the beauty of human ability to create something beautiful in the name of whatever they choose is worthy of serving. Like, so it's also really cool that God's like, this is how I want you to serve me. Not like what you see, because that creative endeavor can also lead to some really, really scary realities, like sacrificing your own children and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, but it just makes the point need to be made that, like, if there is not an ideal, and it is utterly up to human creation in terms of meaning and virtues, if these are truly human creations and not realities, that's terrifying. But it also doesn't discount the fact that it is still a very real aspect of the human existence, the ability to cultivate meaning and to make things sacred. Let's say, like, to create values, structures, and then utilize them for the sake of creating something that's really beautiful, like a temple or something. Like, But if there is no thing that's keeping it check, no ideal keeping it check, it will always result in serving the self-centered nature. And so, I just like that he touches. He's just like, I don't know. He's touched on so many deep things here that we have literally been spending probably 2 hours now, and we could spend probably 3 more. Not that we're going to, but so I like that he says, not that the mystical stuff is necessarily true. It's like, never mind if it's true. Like, let's just stop for a moment and observe the fact that this is a reality. This is an aspect of our ability. This is within
Yeah,
our
it's
ability.
functionally true.
Yeah.
It's functionally true.
Now, with the only thing that's capital T true is that you get to decide how you're going to try to see it. That was the expression of relativism that I was touching on earlier. And I was thinking about it. I was like, that is essentially the product of the knowledge of good and evil. That's what I think invigorated that agency to be able to choose and decide how you're going to see it. That's what gives us choice. That's not what gave us choice, but that's what like broadened our ability to choose. It was no longer about choosing not to eat or to eat. It then went down this long thing of choosing what God to serve, like, or even all these other, even ways talking about choosing to go to a supermarket and choosing to see it this way or choosing to see it that way and choosing what's true and choosing what's meaningful. It's like, it just like overcomplicated. And so like, I just thought that was interesting. Like that relativism just leads to so many, it's a heavy burden to try to shoulder.
Yeah.
Because it makes everything up to you and your choice. And I don't really know how to talk about it in a sense of like, because I too have qualms with speaking in such an absolutist way, because I do think that is true, that we have the ability to decide how we're going to see things. We have the ability to decide what has meaning. That is at our disposal. That is a right, if you will. But I don't think it's a right it's a right that you give up when you choose Jesus.
Yeah. When you say that, I thought of the verse in Matthew 11. You said relativism is a heavy burden to bear. And he says, come to me, all you who are burdened, heavy laden, weary, and I will give you rest. And he talks about taking his yoke, for it's easy and light. And the yoke is a Jewish idiom for you're going to learn how to do things according to your rabbi. And so he's offering to be everyone's teacher of how to do things. And so it's very fascinating, especially in the broadest sense of, from the beginning when we lost our way, our sort of automatic sense, our relationship with God, to then go on the terrible tragedy of history all the way to the point of Jesus offering that to us, and the deep yearning, longing, desire that would have inspired in all of us. And I think it's a felt sense of, even Wallace has a phrase somewhere in there about you just feel like there's something more. You feel
You've
like
lost something that's infinite. He says
yes,
that.
And so, yeah, I think that what you intuit is correct. The interesting part, and a lot of Paul's language would confirm what you're saying about you lose that. You submit that to Christ, and then you become a bondservant or a slave of Jesus.
Well, yeah, maybe you're going to clarify it the same way I would as you just put that. What were you about to say?
Well, so it's like you choose to give up your definitional power in the matter. So you choose to ascribe to what he defines. That's how I would describe it.
Yeah.
Because you said you lose that, but it's not being taken from you. You're giving it to him so that all things are in their proper place.
Yeah. And what I was about to say too is like, you don't lose your ability to choose what has meaning. Because even that, you're choosing Jesus is the one who has ultimate meaning. His words are what has the most ultimate meaning and will dictate my way of thinking. And I no longer have to try to wrestle these things out. I can take the yoke, and he says, and learn of me. But there's also like an aspect of like, what Jesus says, like, anyone who desires to save their life will lose it, but anyone who loses it for my sake will receive it. There is also like when we're talking about sanctifying, to sanctify something is to the way I understand it is like, let's say definitionally, I would say it's utilizing whatever it is for the purpose it was made for. So like a cup, the reason why the cup was made was to hold liquid for me to, well, let's just say hold liquid. Or I could take the cup and beat you over the head with it. Like that's an unsanctified usage of the cup. If I choose then like, you know what, I'm going to stop beating people over the head with the cup. I'm going to start drinking from it again. I have now sanctified the use of that cup. And so with that, even with our right for choice and choosing what has meaning, I think that's actually a better way to put it is that like you give up that right, but then it's actually sanctified in that I still have, I can still choose like even in my pursuit of this career, it's like, first I chose that restoration ecology has meaning to me. And I desire to commit myself to that endeavor of serving that purpose. And now I'm like, you know what? I think education has more meaning to me than that. Like I still can choose what has meaning to me. So it's not like, now I've given up my life to Jesus and like, I don't have to think anymore. He just,
right. He just reads you your script and you follow it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's now sanctified.
Much more relational than that.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of Dallas Willard in general, but then a specific doctrine of his is that we were designed to rule and to reign with God. And so the separation in the beginning leads us to rule and to reign without God. And much of the tragedy of history, all of the tragedy of history, I would lay at the feet of poor wielding of power. And our separation from God directly results in our inability to wield power well, to use it for good. And then it would make sense, following that train of thought, that the rejoining of God and man would lead to the proper orientation of humanity, such that the power that we have and are able to wield then is utilized in service of the good. And so your ability to choose has been given to you for a reason. Your ability to define and describe, even Adam defines and describes the animals. They are what they are, but then he gets to name them. He gets to sort of assert what it is that they are, which is a super cool thing, because God, he is the one doing the asserting, right? Like Adam had no part in the DNA selection process for any of the creatures, but he does get to say how it is that they appear to him and attempt to describe them in a word. And what a difficult game that would be.
Yeah.
Lion.
Yeah.
But the point is that it doesn't, the submission, the what you said, if you try to gain your life, you'll lose it. That's not good. You've been given your life, right? You have your life. And so by trying to gain it or secure it, you lose it. And I think just for the sake of time, we can kind of skip through. He really has some beautiful ways of encapsulating it, but he just talks about the things that you worship and the way they eat you up and the way that they give you more suffering in the specific area because they're out of alignment. None of the things he lists, well, maybe I can't remember, but off the top of my head, none of the things he lists are bad in and of themselves. But if you serve them as the end, then whatever it is that are the means to your end will be insufficient. You will always need to do more. You will always, everything will be demanded of you and nothing will be given to you in return because we all die, right? And so it's like, in a finite sense, you will not find anything that is infinitely sufficient to support your desires.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's that famous C.S. Lewis quote about, if I live in this world and find myself longing for something that I can't find, then perhaps maybe I wasn't made for this world. It's a good like cross stitch quote. It's fine to do cross stitches of just quotes. That's fine. But verses, yeah. I don't support that.
Yeah. The examples he uses was money, intellect, beauty and sexual drive, and power as the things you can choose to worship and how they eat you alive. But he says this, this is really important. He said that, I'll just read the next paragraph, not the whole thing. Because here's something else that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan Mother Goddess or the Four Noble Truths, or some inviolable set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. And so even that, the need for inviolable set of ethical principles, that's where I was like, he's also blending some idealism with relativism, which is in postmodernism, which seems like they're all like they can't coexist objectively, like but he is somehow,
except that they all are perspectives on reality. Someone put a lot of thought into why it is that they think that this is ultimately true. The issue is the word ultimately. It is true in some sense, but you have to let it just be in some sense. That's the issue I think most people have with reading philosophy, is you get entrenched in a certain form of it. It might be interesting to have a conversation on sort of, I don't know what you call that, but like the reason that it's important to believe that only Christianity is true. I think that I could get there. It would just have to be worded properly for me. Like yes, fine, except that you need to be able to observe everything for what it is. And if it's partially true, you need to take that part and you don't need to. You would benefit from taking that part and incorporating it into your perspective of what you believe to be absolutely true.
Yeah. And it does come down to idealism, which, I mean, we could break that down in another podcast. And I'm not going to break it down now, but just the fact that he's alluding to the fact that there needs to be some type of metaphysical principle or ideal that constitutes it dictates your worship. And that it's inviolable. Like if you violate this, you recognize that is going to be destructive. Like there needs to be some kind of underlying ideal or even hierarchy of ideals that you recognize, like these are not circumstantially true, these are objectively true.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're left with worshiping petty things like power or money or sexual drive or any of these other things. And then he says those type of things, they're insidious, and these forms of worship it's not that they're evil or sinful, it's that they're unconscious. So that's what he says is actually the wrong thing about it, is that like these appeal to the parts of you that doesn't require you to actually be intentional about how you're thinking about a thing. Like these appeal to the parts of you where you can just coast. And he says that's why he doesn't say evil or sinful. Really, the true thing that constitutes what's wrong and objectively wrong is being unconscious. And so I thought that was an interesting way of dancing around that too. They are default settings. And so the whole thing of this, the premise of the thing is that like the default settings that you don't really have to think in order to act out, those are actually wrong. The things that you have to be intentional and conscious of and exercise your ability to think is the part of a good education, is something that you can actually utilize to bolster a ability to think intentionally.
Yeah. Yeah. And he might not call them sins, but I think I would be comfortable doing that. I guess the reason he wouldn't is because it can muddy the water if people think that sin is simply a moral, like you're choosing a bad thing. But which might be true in some ultimate sense, but like you are responsible to hit the target, right? Like we've all been given this life to live with, consciously, and you're never going to hit the target if you're not aiming for it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm using the original definition of the word that's used for sin, which is to miss the mark. It was an archery term. And so if you just think of it that way, then any random act with a bow and an arrow won't result in hitting the target, except for one in, a quadrillion chances of an accidental bullseye. You know what I mean? So it's like you need to at least be working in that direction, and that takes conscious effort.
Yeah. Well, and the assertion of his what is capital T true is that you get to choose what that target is. Um, and that is biblically wrong. And so I would argue objectively wrong. Just choosing any target is will set you up to fall into despair, and um, it doesn't cultivate freedom. It demands something of you. This disciplining yourself for the sake of hitting that target. But you deem that target to be worthy of to be the highest goal. And normally those targets aren't as graceful as God is, that they actually share with you who they are. So it's not until you're many years down the road really striving to hit that target that you realize, like, holy shit, the nature of this is sinister and is wanting to kill me. Whereas God is graceful.
That's
and
what he
like,
says.
This is my nature.
Right. He says that the kinds of worship he's just discussed are the kind of worship that you just gradually slip into day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And that's the sinister thing that's trying to destroy you. It's trying to warp your sense of the world and your ability to aim and shoot at the target. Like it's fundamentally warping you.
Yeah. So that would be a critique, but for the sake of time, we are kind of spending a long time on this, so we won't flesh out all those things. But so after that thought of what Ian just shared about the kind of worship you just gradually slip into day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. He says, and the so-called real world will not discourage you from operating on your default settings, because the so-called real world of men and money and power hums merrily along in a pool of fear and anger and frustration and craving and worship of self. Our own present culture has harnessed these forces in ways that have yielded extraordinary wealth and comfort and personal freedom. The freedom all to be lords of our tiny skull-sized kingdoms, alone at the center of all creation. This kind of freedom has much to recommend it, but of course there are all different kinds of freedom, and the kind that is most precious you will not hear much talk about in the great outside world of wanting and achieving. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline, and being able truly to care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad petty, unsexy ways every day. That is real freedom.
I think that's... Sorry, go ahead.
That is real freedom. That is being educated and understanding how to think. The alternative is unconsciousness, the default setting, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing.
That is if you try to save your soul, you will lose it. And if you try to gain your life, you will lose it. And if you lose your life for his sake, then you will receive it. It's like you are stuck in the rat race when you try to gain your soul, and it kills you. It kills you. It renders you dead, which is what killed means. But it's like you are alive when you give it up. Like he says it. When you the important kind of freedom involves attention, awareness, and discipline, and being able to truly care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad petty, unsexy ways every day. And that is losing your life for his sake. That is what he calls you to do.
And if that's the thing is why that struck me is because it is in keeping with the Christian assertion, but it's not informed by the gospel. Because if Jesus merely asked us to just mimic his life and his sacrifice and his passion, then it would be no different than any other petty god of like demanding sacrifice of you and to give up everything for my sake. But the gospel, Jesus' instruction there is to give your life for me and find it, is that it's in light of the fact that he gave it all and that it is finished.
Yeah, but he wouldn't be asking us to imitate. I think what Jesus did is live his life in such a way that is imitative of the structure of reality. That's what I would say. And so that's why Wallace is able to come to the same conclusion without necessarily acknowledging or believing or referencing the Gospels as a literally true story. He believes it to be functionally true just by what he just said.
But what I'm saying is the danger of doing that, of trying to reach that conclusion without the reality of Jesus and his atonement and resurrection, is that it's inevitably going to lead you to burnout. It's a crucifixion without the hope of resurrection.
Yeah. We don't have to end right there, but I think that'll be in a little ellipses for our next podcast, because I think that I don't think I can elaborate necessarily right now, but I think I just said kind of what I think. Then you clarified it, and I want to clarify by saying what I just said. So that doesn't seem constructive, but just like I think that it's the structure of reality that Jesus exemplified, and that story is what you can choose to believe or not believe. But you're saying that that's what he's offering, a different path where you don't have to believe that story. You just believe a story that is inviolable or whatever.
Well, no, I'm just saying that if for that to be, because it's very much in line with like a cultural Christianity, like this is a Western value, this
right. Yes.
This agape,
and the premise for it is the gospel, right? So it's sort of like you can't remove the gospel from the premise of what he's saying, and yet you're saying that he did remove it. I'm saying that he didn't remove it. He actually captured the essence of it without the overt description of the mechanism of it, or if you want to be crude about it, but like the death and the resurrection. But the death and resurrection are offered there in the petty daily sacrifice of yourself.
Well, I'm saying is that it's akin to a cultural Christianity, like a works-based salvation, in that if you don't fully understand the hope of the gospel, and instead you see the gospel as a prescription on how you ought to live your life, then that results in legalism and inevitable burnout, to where like what's motivating my actions isn't even a response of gratitude and worship to the reality that I have faith in, that what Jesus says is true, it is finished. because even Jesus did it for the hope set before him, or the joy set before him, right? Like, uh, and so if you don't fully embrace the hope of the gospel, um, then you have no joy set before you to endure such suffering that you are willingly subjecting yourself to. Um, and so I guess it begs the question. I mean, yeah, it's interesting because then it's like, uh, is self-sacrificial love good for the sake of doing it, or is it good for the sake of it's pleasing to God?
I don't think it's a either or. I think it is a both and both are descriptive of, or just both are real. It is both pleasing to God and good for the sake of doing it, because the reality that we inhabit is informed by God, like it is reflective of God. He's the creator, just as anything that anyone creates is reflective of them. They define things a certain way because of their character, their makeup, their personality.
Yeah. The reason why I pose it that way too, I mean, that's just what logic does. There has to be a dilemma. I always boil things down to dilemmas.
Yeah, yeah.
But
The reason I jumped into it, sorry, I'm doing it again, but is because that's why we're here. But before, when I said it, I mean, like, I don't think he's, for whatever reason, at this point in my understanding of things, I don't see it as such of a danger, because what he's acknowledging is the good thing. So the burnout is possible, but I'm not purporting that you need to take it on as your burden to sustain what is good here. It just is good, and then you get to lighten your burden by living according to it. You know what I mean? Like, Jesus teaches you and you will learn of him, as you said. And that relationship is crucial, and you and I depend on it daily, hopefully.
yeah, yeah.
But in depending on that relationship, it is our, like, that manifests in our lives by the degree to which we are actively putting our faith in him by carrying out these petty acts of self-sacrifice for the good of others, for the good of the world. And it's not only in service of an abstract spiritual God that is far away. Obviously, like, we are talking about our day-to-day lives and the way that it impacts them. Like, the good that comes of self-sacrifice is bound up in this idea that it pleases God. And one way to think of it is you must do everything in your life to please God. If you think that that's what saves you, that's an issue. But then the other way to think of it is you must do everything that you can to self-sacrifice because that is good. And if you think that that is what justifies you, that is also bad. And so it's like you can turn both systems into a means of self-justification. But the point is that you are designed and therefore sanctified when you fulfill your role of giving to the world, to God, to others, what it is that's within you. Whatever is within your capacity to rule and reign over towards a good and positive end, that is for you to do. And if you don't do it, it's bad. Like, there's no justification for that or for doing it in the positive sense. I asked my dad after destroying my siblings in a board game recently if he loved me anymore. And he said, "No, I don't love you anymore." Because it has nothing to do with the reason that he loves me. And it is unreasonable, like it maybe cannot be posed in a logical dilemma, which sorry, which I honestly do want to talk more about this in another podcast, because I think that is a dilemma that people pose. Why does God love me? It's because of Jesus. That's it. I don't believe that. I don't like, maybe I do in some sense, but I feel like it's framed improperly to say that the only reason that God can love me is because of the blood of Jesus. Is like, I don't know what that means. I don't know how to reconcile that with a lot of other stuff that I think about God and the way that he treats me, you know? But I guess, like I'm saying, I think it definitely needs to be maybe a 10 podcast series of elaboration.
The reason why I'm addressing this is because I do believe that he is touching on a matter of life and death, um, and he is right to attribute this to have this being what he asserts in his speech, um, attributing the power of choice and choosing what has meaning, and especially the aspect of it of like what's preventing people putting guns to their head. Um, I'm addressing, and maybe this is a cheap shot, but it's quite apparent in his life that what he believes here did not prevent him from doing that. Um,
Mm.
and it's because the gospel actually has the full picture. And this assertion, the really important kind of freedom, involves attention, awareness, and discipline, and being able truly to care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad petty, unsexy ways every day. It's most certainly a Christian ideal, um, but it's not informed by the most essential aspect of the big picture that Christianity provides. Um, and even in reading this, maybe people are listening to this and like it evokes existential crisis. The
Mm-hmm.
type of existential crisis that this provocative thing ought to evoke, like, and it's not bad to have the existential crisis. Like, yeah, what is stopping me from killing the terrible master, which is my mind? Um, how do I find freedom? And it does involve attention, awareness, discipline, and being able to truly sacrifice yourself for other people. It does involve that. Um, so maybe he's right to phrase it that way, but uh, that's not utter freedom. He says that is real freedom, but that's not. I don't think that's not where utter freedom lies, in the choosing to love. Um, and so that's why I'm trying to tackle this.
Maybe what you're addressing is the capacity for this. So like, he maybe asserts more of a, within each of us is the capacity to choose to do this. And that's where the burden comes in, because why am I not choosing to do this? But what you're addressing is the power of the gospel to liberate someone to do these things. And the issue then is the power yours, or is it coming from something greater and beyond you? And so I think that is very interesting. And again, I would love to talk way more about that, but I think that's the distinction that
Yeah, and
we were sort of.
this is also posed as an antidote to the base nature, the selfish nature to us too. So that's the other side of it too. It's like, in choosing to do this, you can overcome the part of your nature that is self-centered, that the Bible would say is your sinful state. Um, you can overcome sin through living as Jesus did, sacrificing yourself for other people, and that's actually not real freedom. That's also also yet another another thing that can. Uh, and so I think that's the thing, is like he's so close. He's so close. Um, but in the relativity of being able to, I get to dictate what target I'm aiming for. And then he's making the argument that the target they aim for is self-sacrificial love, which isn't far. But again, uh, I think it did exactly what he claimed it would do. Um, these are the kind of worship you just gradually slip into, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. Um, and it's, I don't know, I think I really want to study more of his work too, just because he's such a beautiful human being, and it's so tragic. Um, and it seems like this is a common theme in his writings of trying to overcome suicidal tendencies and struggling with the meaning of life. And the fact that it just breaks my heart that he wasn't able to find the freedom that he's purporting is found in what he's laying out here. Um, but it's so damn close. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It is. He says, oh, I was just going to say, I was going to skip to the end to sum it up, but he says the capital T truth is about life before death. It is about the real value of a real education, which has almost nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with simple awareness. Awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us all the time, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water. This is water. It is unimaginably hard to do this, to stay conscious and alive in the adult world day in and day out, which means yet another grand cliche turns out to be true. Your education really is the job of a lifetime, and it commences now. I wish you way more than luck. I think as it relates to what we were just talking about, that the simple awareness is sort of a matter of what it is that you are aware of, because there, like you're saying, there are so many things that you can be aware of, or that you could attribute what it is that you are aware of to, but it is a matter of who it is that you're attributing it to. And if it's just some cosmic sense of unity, that's pretty close. Those are words that could be used to describe reality accurately, but there is a relational component to interacting with Jesus that is extremely transformational for one, but essential at a point. I think we did stumble upon next week's topic, though. I'm raring to go.
Yeah, and I do think I love his assertion here too, because this is one that I think a lot of Christians overlook too. The capital T truth is about life before death.
Absolutely.
I think that's amazing. And so I think that's something that I need to hear a lot too, because a lot of times I turn these. It's a struggle I've struggled with my whole life, but turning Christianity or the Bible or the gospel into just another philosophy and dealing with abstract assertions and trying to find out how to articulate it in a way that's consistent and logical and rational. And but I love that he says the real value of education has almost nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with simple awareness. And it's like sometimes I get so lost in the minutia that I'm not aware of the fact that, like, oh, this isn't really about some other type of reality that I need to experience some kind of mystical experience or something. But it's like actually my human existence, the gospel is actually helping me to truly live that, and not just hope for eternity and hope for Jesus to come back and fix everything. It's like the kingdom of God is at hand, and that is very relevant to life before death. So,
Yeah. Well put.
yeah.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
This was excellent.
This is a lot of fun.
Yeah. I look forward to next week. And yeah. This is water.
This is water. That's right. All right. Till next time.